Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the mysterious world of how did the Wild West shape the American dream we know today. A tale of power, betrayal, and hidden truths. Some stories make you question how far humans will go for pride or survival. This is one of them. So dim the lights, take a breath, and if calm yet dark history fascinates you, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's travel back in time. We are not heading to sun-baked mesas or dusty saloons. Not exactly, but to the kingdom of Ethelgard, a place ruled by the heavy hand of tradition and the even heavier purse of a tyrannical king. A place where the concept of frontier was about to replace the concept of fate. See, the established east of Ethelgard was suffocating. Every field, every forest, every life mapped, measured, and taxed by the whims of petty nobles and an ever-watching crown. The air itself felt old, thick with the scent of damp wool and generations of resignation, a scent that clung to the peasant's tunic like a second skin, impossible to scrub away no matter how hard they scrubbed at the meager streams. This was the antithesis of the dream. King Uther the Arrogant sat on a throne carved from petrified oak, his mind consumed not by the welfare of his people, but by the endless rumor of what lay beyond the whispering peaks, in a vast, untamed expanse known only as the Sundered Lands, or more simply, the Marches. This distant, lawless territory, a geographical analog to the Wild West, was a jagged scar across the map of Ethelgard, a place everyone feared, yet everyone whispered about, usually after too much watered-down ale in a darkened tavern corner. The whispers were the spark, the tiny, dangerous ember that Uther unknowingly fanned into a raging, kingdom-defining fire. They spoke of veins of gold so wide they shimmered like frozen rivers under the midday sun, of vast, unclaimed tracts of fertile soil waiting for a plow, and most importantly, of a place where a man was judged by his grit, not by the status of his grandfather's birthright. This, in medieval Ethelgard, was the embryonic American dream. It was the ultimate chance for the serf, the indebted, the forgotten, to shed the shackles of the East's ironclad social hierarchy and become, truly, their own master. A self-made man, or woman, which was an entirely radical, near-heretical idea in this rigid feudal structure. The initial trek, however, was not one of hope, but one of desperation fueled by a newly enacted, monstrous law from King Uther, a piece of legislation so profoundly cruel it deserved its own dark chapter in history. This was the Edict of Perpetual Debt. The edict stipulated that any peasant, any commoner, or even any minor noble who chose to leave the established domains of the East for the opportunities of the Marches had to legally pledge 50%, a full half, of all future earnings, property, and wealth, no matter how great or small, back to the king forever. Not just their lifetime, mind you, but every generation of their bloodline, stretching into perpetuity. It was a tax on freedom itself, a cruel, cold acknowledgement that even if you escaped the land, you could never truly escape the crown's insatiable hunger for gold. It ensured the frontier would not be settled by true free men, but by an endless stream of indentured ambition, all feeding the king's coffers back in the gilded, suffocating East. The cruelty didn't stop there. Uther, fearful of dissent and the growing power of this decentralized, self-governing population in the West, also implemented the infamous law of the Whispering Wind. This odd, terrifying law stated that simply suggesting the king was fallible, that he might have made a mistake, or that his divine right could be questioned, was punishable by having the offender's tongue permanently marked. It wasn't cut out, which would have been mercifully quick, but rather, a searing hot needle was used to tattoo a tiny, intricate image of a whimpering dog onto the tongue's surface, a permanent mark of intellectual servitude. The pain was said to drive men mad, and the shame, even worse, ensuring that those who dared to speak out could never speak freely again. Their words forever tasted like ash and submission. It was into this atmosphere of crushing systemic injustice and tantalizing, dangerous promise that we meet Alara, a peasant woman from the village of Oakhaven. Alara was not meek. She had eyes the color of storm clouds and a spirit that the grinding machinery of feudal life had failed to crush. She watched her father toil, watched her brother starve, and decided that the king's cruel tax was merely the price of admission to a life unowned, a price she was willing to pay, even if it meant risking a fate worse than poverty. Her American dream was simple: to own a small plot of land that no noble could ever claim, where her voice was the only law that mattered inside her small, protective fence line. Alara sold the only heirloom her family possessed, a tarnished silver locket, and joined a caravan heading west, a ragged assembly of desperate souls. The journey itself was a brutal mirror of the frontier experience, a chaotic lawlessness that was the foundation of the Wild West concept. The roads were ruled by opportunistic bandits, essentially medieval cattle rustlers and highwaymen, who operated with impunity because the king's justice simply didn't extend beyond the official border forts. They were the first, unofficial law of the marches. The strong take from the weak, and self-defense is the only trial that matters. In the caravan, a kind of rough democracy formed, a fleeting, temporary social contract born of necessity and shared peril. Decisions about rationing, about defense, about the pace of travel were made collectively around meager fires, a stark contrast to the absolute obedience demanded back in the East. This was the first true seed of the American dream, the idea of self-governance, of deciding your own fate with fellow travelers, without the crushing weight of a hereditary authority figure. But this nascent democracy was fragile, easily shattered by fear, and often superseded by the raw power of the strongest man with the sharpest blade, a perfect reflection of the chaos that would later define the gold rush towns. When Alara finally reached the edge of the true sundered lands, what she found was not the shimmering gold river of rumor, but a sprawling, dusty chaos. Settlers had staked claims haphazardly, marking their territories with rough-hewn signs and aggressive vigilance. The settlements, little more than temporary camps, were ruled not by the king's magistrate, but by the appointed royal governor of the marches, a man named Lord Malachi. Malachi was the personification of power abuse, a noble who saw the marches not as an opportunity for the people, but as his own personal, self-enriching fiefdom, a place where he could ignore the few remaining noble laws of the East and invent his own, truly heinous systems of control. Lord Malachi was arrogant and fat, draped in silks that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty, windswept shanty towns he governed. He enforced what he called the law of the claim jumper's hand, a barbaric interpretation of property rights. If a person was merely accused of attempting to steal a claim, regardless of actual proof, they would be subjected to the test of endurance. This test involved having one hand submerged in a vat of boiling, tar-thick oil for the duration of a slow-burning candle. If the hand was withdrawn prematurely, the accusation was deemed true, and the hand was severed immediately. If the person endured the full burning of the candle, they were declared innocent, though left with a hand permanently maimed and useless. Justice here was not about truth or evidence, but about a person's sheer capacity for pain, a brutal lottery designed by a cruel mind to instill terror and discourage any challenge to his corrupt authority, a true hallmark of the dark side of unchecked frontier power. Alara witnessed this system firsthand. She saw a young man, barely 18, scream as he tried to endure the oil, a peasant accused of trying to steal 3 nuggets of gold from a wealthy merchant's claim. He pulled his hand out early, driven mad by the heat and the stench of burning flesh, and Lord Malachi's silent, hooded executioner swung the cleaver without hesitation. The injustice of it all hardened Alara's spirit further, turning her dream of peaceful land ownership into a more determined, more dangerous quest for autonomy and power. She realized that the American dream, in this Wild West allegory, wasn't just about hard work. It was about the power to defend the rewards of that hard work, the need to enforce your own justice when the official system was hopelessly broken or actively malicious. So Alara did not stake a claim. Instead, she began trading. She was sharp, resourceful, and unafraid to negotiate with the shady characters that dominated the marches, the smugglers, the half-civilized tribes of the outer edge, and the independent miners who distrusted everyone wearing clean clothes. She became a vital link, moving necessary supplies like tools, salted meats, and perhaps most dangerously, information from one isolated settlement to another. Her reputation grew, a silent, steady force in a land dominated by bluster and gunpowder. She was embodying the self-reliance and entrepreneurial spirit that would come to define the successful frontier folk, the ones who shaped the dream not with a pickaxe, but with quiet, calculated risk. Meanwhile, back in the lavish, insulated East, King Uther was growing increasingly erratic and arrogant. The vast river of gold flowing from the marches, though heavily taxed by the perpetual debt, was intoxicating. He began to believe his own propaganda, that he was a genius king who had solved poverty by simply exporting it to a dangerous frontier and taxing its inevitable success. He started spending lavishly, building colossal, unnecessary monuments to himself, funded by the pain and the effort of the settlers like Alara. He imposed even more odd laws on the Eastern nobles, primarily aimed at humiliating them, forcing them to ride backwards on donkeys in public if they failed to pay their own ridiculous taxes on time, a spectacle that briefly amused the masses, but ultimately only highlighted the king's instability. Queen Lyra, Uther's wife, was a quiet, calculating woman who watched her husband's downfall with cold, detached interest. She knew the marches were the true power. She understood that by letting the peasants and minor nobles go west, Uther had unwittingly created a new class of wealthy, independent people who owned nothing to the traditional feudal structure except the half-tax, which, ironically, only fueled their resentment. She began sending her own agents west, not to collect taxes or enforce others' cruel laws, but to subtly cultivate loyalty, positioning herself as the future, more merciful alternative to her increasingly monstrous husband. She was laying the groundwork for a political revolution, using the Wild West's wealth and independent spirit as her lever against the old order. One of Lyra's most effective tools was a subtle amendment to the law of perpetual debt. While Uther demanded 50% paid immediately, Lyra's agents began to spread the word, secretly, that the queen believed in the frontier spirit, and that she would allow the settlers to pay their 50% in infrastructure rather than gold, by building roads, schools, and self-sustaining defensive forces. This simple change was revolutionary, It allowed the settlers to invest in their own dream, making their 50% tax payment benefit their community directly, rather than just filling others' distant vaults. It was a brilliant manipulation, twisting the cruel debt into a form of collective, self-governing power. Alara caught wind of this subtle political shift. It was a risk, aligning with the queen, but she saw the wisdom. She used her growing influence among the scattered settlements to organize the creation of the Western Assembly, a council of settlers, miners, and traders, all bound by the goal of building a stable society. They began to pool their collective 50% tax into the construction of a great stone wall, not for the king, but for themselves, against the harsh environment and the persistent bandit problem. They were, in effect, forging their own civilization, writing their own social contract, just as the future settlers of the American West would establish local laws and vigilante committees when federal law was absent or ineffective. The frontier was transforming the peasants into self-sufficient citizens, a true birth of a new kind of individual identity. The king, in his arrogance, was oblivious. He saw the reports of construction as proof of his own greatness, believing they were building him massive fortresses to protect his gold. He was too consumed by his final, grand project, the Tower of Infinite Majesty, a structure so tall it was meant to scrape the very clouds, built by Eastern peasants driven nearly to death by his impossible demands. His downfall began, as so many downfalls do, with a single, brazen act of defiance from the West he thought he controlled. Lord Malachi, the corrupt governor, had become too comfortable. He seized the claim of a particularly successful mining family, a group who had survived years of hardship, claiming they were in arrears on their perpetual debt, though the settlers knew he was simply greedy. This family, led by a hardened man named Cale, had endured enough. Instead of submitting to the test of endurance, Cale, supported by Alara and the Western Assembly, publicly refused. He declared that their hard-earned wealth was being invested in their shared wall, as per the Queen's suggested amendment, and that they would not remit a single coin to the corrupt Malachi. Malachi, furious at this challenge to his supreme power, attempted to arrest Cale and his family. But he faced not a collection of frightened peasants, but an organized, armed militia, the Western Assembly's defensive force. The settlers of the marches, realizing that they had more in common with each other than with the distant, oppressive East, chose to stand together. This wasn't a rebellion against the crown yet, but a stand against corruption and tyranny on their own soil. It was the medieval equivalent of the regulator movements and local defense leagues of the American frontier, where the absence of justice forced men to become the law themselves. The standoff was brutal. Malachi, confident in the superiority of his armored guards, ordered them to charge. But the settlers, hardened by years of surviving the unforgiving marches, were more disciplined, more tactical, and fighting with a ferocity born of protecting their dream. They ambushed Malachi's men, routing them in a matter of hours. Malachi himself was captured, not killed, but subjected to a form of justice decided by the assembly. They did not use the king's methods, no boiling oil or marked tongues. Instead, they stripped him of his fine clothes, publicly tallied all the gold and land he had stolen, and forced him to stand on a platform for 3 days, reading aloud a written confession of his abuses to every settler who passed by, a punishment aimed at shamming and delegitimizing the old power structure in the eyes of the people. The news of this uprising, of the humiliation of a royal governor by mere peasants, swept back to the east. King Uther, consumed by his own arrogance and his tower-building mania, saw it as a minor inconvenience, a pest problem. He dismissed his advisors who urged caution, and in a fit of megalomania, he declared a new, ultimate law, the Grand Edict of Absolute Submission. This law stated that every single man and woman who had settled in the marches must return to the east within 1 month, relinquish all property, and submit to a lifetime of forced labor on his tower of infinite majesty. He intended to crush the dream and reassert total, centralized power, believing that the frontier was merely a distraction from his true destiny. This was his fatal error, the moment his own unchecked pride ensured his downfall. The settlers of the marches were not going to return. They had tasted freedom, however harsh, however unjust at times, and they had built something with their own hands. The idea of returning to servitude, after forging their own identity in the wilderness, was unthinkable. They were no longer just peasants. They were frontier people, a new, self-defined category of citizen whose loyalty was to their land and their community, not to a distant king. Queen Lyra, having patiently cultivated her network of loyalty among the discontented Eastern nobles and the now powerful Western Assembly, made her move. She presented herself as the only hope for peace, the one who understood the spirit of the marches, and was willing to forgive the rebellion if they would simply recognize her as the new monarch. The Eastern nobles, tired of Uther's madness and his endless taxes, and fearful of the economic collapse that would surely follow if the Western gold mines stopped producing, quietly supported her. The Western Assembly, led by Ilara, saw Lyra as the lesser of two evils, a necessary political transition to secure their autonomy. The king's downfall was anticlimactic and swift, a testament to how fragile the power of an arrogant ruler can be when the economic base and the people's loyalty are both hollowed out. As Uther stood on the scaffolding of his half-finished tower of infinite majesty, admiring the view, a small contingent of the queen's guards arrived, quietly and efficiently. They did not execute him. That would make him a martyr. Instead, they invoked his own law of the whispering wind against him. They accused him of questioning the queen's rightful claim to the throne, a charge Lyra had fabricated, and subjected him to the tongue tattoo punishment. The very tool of his cruelty became the instrument of his shame. They marked his tongue with the image of the whimpering dog, ensuring that the former king of Ethelgard could no longer utter a word of pride or authority without searing pain and public disgrace. He was then confined to the highest room of his own incomplete tower, a gilded prisoner watching his realm reshape itself without him. Queen Lyra ascended the throne. Her first act, a symbolic and politically brilliant one, was to immediately abolish the Edict of Perpetual Debt. This was the ultimate victory for the spirit of the Wild West. By eliminating the debt, she transformed the indentured ambitions of the settlers into genuine freedom. The Western Assembly, no longer merely a militia but a legitimate political entity, formalized its own system of governance, a self-ruling territory within the kingdom, responsible for its own laws, its own defenses, and its own future. The marches, the sundered lands, continued to be a chaotic, dangerous place, a true frontier. But the fundamental contract of existence there had changed. A person's success was no longer ultimately determined by their birth or their king's tax laws, but by their courage, their resilience, and their willingness to collaborate with others for collective protection. The frontier had shaped a new identity, the self-made, autonomous citizen, fiercely protective of their property and their freedom. The moral of this strange, medieval allegory is clear, and it speaks directly to the legacy of the Wild West and the American dream we still chase today. The dream itself, the hope of upward mobility, self-determination, and a life unowned by others, was born not in the comfortable East, but in the chaos of the marches. It was forged in the fire of injustice, driven by the desire to escape cruel, systemic oppression, and crystallized by the necessity of creating a social contract among themselves when the crown failed to provide one. However, the shape of the dream, the way it was ultimately realized, was irrevocably marked by the Wild West experience. It became inextricably linked to lawlessness, to brutal self-reliance, to the idea that the strong survive and make their own rules, and often to the exploitation of others. Just as Alara and the Assembly, in their necessity, had to be ruthless with Malachi and with the bandits. The American dream became not just a beautiful aspiration of freedom, but a hard, often brutal contract where autonomy often required a willingness to use force to defend it. It was a dream achieved through chaos, and thus, its very DNA was infused with a strain of rugged individualism that sometimes valued the lack of law over the establishment of equitable law. The settlers of Ethelgard's marches gained their freedom, but they also created a culture that instinctively distrusted centralized authority, a culture where local, vigilante justice often trumped the slow, imperfect processes of centralized law. This is the enduring paradox of the American dream, shaped by its own Wild West frontier. The pursuit of absolute individual freedom, often leading to a society that struggles to find the balance between necessary self-reliance and necessary collective governance. Alara's triumph was real, but the price was a permanent, deep-seated belief that the true source of security lay not in institutions, but in the readiness of the individual or a small, self-selected group to enforce their own vision of right and wrong, a shadow that still stretches long over the modern pursuit of success and freedom. The frontier gave them the dream, but it also taught them to keep their own hand on the hilt of the sword, just in case. And this is where the deeper, quieter currents of the story truly begin to flow, because the transition of power from King Uther to Queen Lyra, while initially heralded as a triumph for the frontier spirit, only subtly altered the nature of the control, rather than eradicating it entirely. The establishment of the Western Assembly, Alara's Council of Self-Governance, was a powerful step toward autonomy, yes, but it immediately faced an internal crisis, a reflection of the inherent tension within the Wild West ethos, the conflict between individual liberty and communal order. This is the next, more subtle layer of how the frontier shaped the dream. See, the marches were still full of gold. The abolition of the perpetual debt had an immediate, explosive effect, not unlike pouring accelerant onto an already volatile fire. The population of the sundered lands swelled almost overnight. New settlers poured in from the eastern provinces, not just the desperate now, but the opportunists, the merchants, the second and third sons of nobles, all eager to stake their claim in a land where the fruits of their labor were finally, truly their own. This influx brought with it a renewed, and far more intense, wave of lawlessness, because while the king's law had been cruel, at least it had been predictable. The new system, crafted by Alara and her assembly, was still too young and too localized to handle the sheer volume of human greed suddenly unleashed. Alara and her council, who had fought for freedom, now found themselves in the impossible position of having to create restrictions. They had to delineate property lines, mediate violent claim disputes, and determine punishments for crimes that ranged from petty theft to brutal murder, all without the centralized authority or established legal codes of the East they had so fiercely rejected. They were forced to invent law from scratch in the dust and the chaos, and their immediate response was to lean into the very spirit of the marches that had created them, a quick, severe, and public form of justice. They established the arbitration by duel for property disputes, a formal, supervised one-on-one combat to the first blood, where the victor would take the disputed claim. This was an attempt to manage the violence, to turn chaotic gunfights, or in this medieval setting, chaotic sword-and-axe fights, into a regulated spectacle. It was a dark, practical solution that prioritized immediate resolution over exhaustive investigation, a system that favored the strong, the well-armed, and the experienced fighter, which perfectly mirrored the might-makes-right philosophy that often characterized the most intense periods of the American frontier. The message was clear. Your claim is only as good as your ability to defend it. But the real crisis arose when the Assembly had to deal with a case of serial claim jumping and violence. A gang, led by a ruthless former mercenary named Corvus, began systematically terrorizing the smaller, less defended settlements, taking gold and land, and leaving a trail of suffering in their wake. They were too strong for any single settlement to fight off, and too mobile for the newly formed Western Guard to pin down. The Assembly, committed to their newfound system of autonomy and local governance, was reluctant to ask Queen Lyra for military aid, fearing it would be the first step back towards central control, the fatal concession that would nullify the hard-won independence. Ilara argued passionately before the Assembly. She reminded them that the dream they fought for was not the freedom to exploit others, but the freedom to build a life of one's own. She insisted that justice had to be collective and swift to protect the weak, lest their frontier descend into pure anarchy, a state worse than King Other's oppressive order. Her words were a desperate plea to temper the Wild West's inherent individualism with the necessary structure of a functioning society. The Assembly, after weeks of heated debate, finally voted to authorize a vigilance committee, a group of the toughest, most respected settlers, including Ilara, to hunt down Corvus's gang. This vigilance committee, a direct medieval parallel to the frontier vigilantes, operated outside the normal, slow processes of the new Western Guard. They were empowered to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the field, a necessary evil, the Assembly argued, to establish law and order in the face of absolute chaos. This was the moment the dream became truly, morally complicated. When the Vigilance Committee finally cornered Corvus and his men in a dusty canyon known as the Serpent's Coil, there was no trial, no formal process. There was a desperate, bloody battle. Ilara, wielding a short-bladed axe with grim determination, fought with the same ferocity she had used to survive the journey west. The fight was a raw, primal expression of the march's justice, a swift, lethal reckoning. The gang was eliminated, and the gold was recovered. The problem, however, was that the Vigilance Committee, having tasted the intoxicating power of quick, self-determined justice, did not immediately disband. They had established order, yes, but in doing so, they had also established themselves as a new, formidable, and unaccountable source of power. They had become a shadow government, feared by the honest settlers almost as much as they had been feared by the bandits. The American dream in the marches, having successfully thrown off the yoke of the Crown's tyranny, now faced a new, self-imposed tyranny. The tyranny of the self-appointed lawman, the hero who cannot put down his badge and gun, the inevitable result of empowering individuals to act as the ultimate arbiters of justice in a lawless land. This subtle shift in power dynamics, the transition from fighting for freedom to fighting to define freedom, had profound implications for the very meaning of success in the marches. Success was no longer merely about staking a claim and striking gold. It was about building enough social and physical power to survive the scrutiny of the Vigilance Committee, the violence of the remaining outlaws, and the endless competition of the new, ambitious settlers. Self-reliance, the core tenet of the dream, was now measured not just in how well you worked, but in how well you defended yourself against your neighbors. Ilara, realizing the terrible path they were on, made a difficult, highly unpopular decision. She stood before the assembly and publicly denounced the continued existence of the Vigilance Committee. She argued that the very thing they had fought to escape, unaccountable, unilateral power, was now residing in their own hands. She insisted that true freedom required imperfect, slow but transparent law, not the swift, dark efficiency of vigilante action. This moment was the intellectual pivot point for the marches, the transition from a Wild West mentality to a nascent rule of law society, a mirror of the transition that occurred in the actual American frontier when territories sought statehood and stability. Her speech was met with hostility. Many of her former allies, the ones who had fought Corvus, saw her as weak, as betraying the hard-won lesson of the marches, that only force commands respect. But Ilara's voice was strong, carrying the moral authority of a true revolutionary, not just a fighter. She invoked the memory of King Uther's absurd laws, the cruelty of Malachi's boiling oil, reminding them that the path to tyranny is often paved with the very best intentions for order. She proposed that the Western Guard be expanded, that formal courts with designated judges and clear-cut, written laws be established, creating a system that, while slower, ensured that justice was blind to the strength of the accuser's sword arm. It was a slow, agonizing process. The transition was resisted by the very men who had become the symbols of frontier success. One by one, however, the settlements began to agree, weary of the constant threat of unaccountable power, whether it came from a king's decree or a vigilante's badge. They realized that the true, enduring American dream was not just the chance to get rich, but the promise that once you were rich, that wealth, and your life, was protected by a system of law that even the powerful could not easily circumvent. The frontier had taught them the value of freedom by showing them the agonizing cost of its absence, and now they were willing to trade a little bit of the wild for a lot more stable. Back in the East, Queen Lyra, observing this internal struggle, played her hand with masterful subtlety. She sent a delegation of scholars, not soldiers, to the marches. These scholars brought with them copies of the ancient laws of Ethilgard, not to reimpose them, but to offer them as a template, a framework from which the Western Assembly could build its own unique legal code. She presented it not as an act of central control, but as an act of collaboration, acknowledging the legitimacy and autonomy of the Western Assembly. She recognized that the old King Uther had tried to crush the dream, but that she, Lyra, would instead co-opt it, granting them enough self-governance to keep the gold flowing, while subtly ensuring their legal framework was still ultimately compatible with the larger kingdom. Ilara embraced this. She worked with the scholars, adapting the old laws of property and commerce to the unforgiving, individualistic reality of the marches. The result was the Charter of Self-Determination, a document that officially recognized the Western Assembly as the sole governing body of the sundered lands. It enshrined the right to own land, the right to vote for local leadership, and most importantly, the right to a fair, public trial by a jury of one's peers. The frontier, the Wild West, had effectively written its own constitution, codifying the principles of self-reliance, opportunity, and limited government into a formal legal structure. This charter, born of the chaos of the marches, became the gold standard for the entire kingdom. The eastern provinces, still governed by the rigid, ancient feudal codes, began to look westward with envy and aspiration. They saw that the settlers, the former serfs and the debt-ridden, had created a system that offered upward mobility, justice, and a chance to rise based on merit, not blood. The American dream, born in the desperation of a chaotic frontier, was now becoming the aspirational model for the old, suffocating core of the kingdom. The ultimate moral lesson of the story, stretching beyond the immediate downfall of the arrogant King Other and the rise of the autonomous Alara, is one of transformation and compromise. The Wild West, or the Marches, did not just give birth to the American dream. It fundamentally shaped its character, infusing it with a permanent, often conflicting blend of ideals. It taught the individual the power of absolute freedom and self-determination, the belief that success is entirely possible through sheer force of will and labor, regardless of background. This is the beautiful, compelling side of the dream. But it also instilled a deep, perhaps unhealthy, suspicion of all forms of governance and collective authority, prioritizing the individual's right to be his or her own law, a belief born from the justifiable experience of King Other's corruption and Lord Malachi's cruelty. This frontier experience means the dream is forever laced with a rugged, sometimes paranoid individualism that struggles to submit to the necessary constraints of a harmonious, collective society. The Wild West forced them to become heroes of their own story, but it also made them wary of any other story's author. The legacy is a constant tension, a perpetual negotiation between the essential need for order and the passionate, hard-won right to be eternally free and self-reliant, a negotiation that continues, in 1,000 subtle ways, to define the American identity even today. The dust of the marches settled, the gold mines eventually began to wane, but the fundamental contract between the individual and society, written in the blood and sweat of the frontier, remained, an enduring, complicated blueprint for a new way of life. The final image, the quiet closing of the story, rests with Alara years later. She is an elderly woman now, her face etched with the harsh lines of survival, sitting not on a throne, but on the porch of a small, sturdy cabin she built herself, near the very wall the assembly first constructed. She watches the next generation of children play, children who know King Other only as a cruel, almost mythical figure from old history, a distant, defeated memory. They are free children, running across land their parents truly own. Yet, even in their carefree play, she notices the sons and daughters of the marches are always competitive, always quick to defend their chosen territory in the dust, always ready to enforce their own small, self-made rules upon their peers. And she smiles, a tired, knowing smile, because she understands that while the crown's tyranny is gone, the indelible mark of the frontier, the persistent, necessary toughness of the Wild West, remains etched upon the soul of the land and its people, a permanent, complex legacy woven into the very fabric of their new, fragile dream. And that, my friends, is how the Wild West, in all its darkness and its glory, truly shaped the dream we know. Yes. And the story doesn't truly end there, does it? Because even the success of the Charter and the rise of Queen Lyra's more tempered reign created unforeseen consequences, proving that the frontier's influence was less about a single event and more about a permanent alteration of the psychological landscape. The wealth and self-governance of the marches created a new kind of aristocracy, a merit aristocracy built on gold and grit, but an aristocracy nonetheless. The children of the original pioneers, the sons and daughters of Ilara's generation, were born into a world where the challenge was not survival, but maintenance. They inherited wealth, they inherited political power within the Western Assembly, and they grew up with a sense of entitlement that directly contradicted the self-made ethos of their parents. They never had to endure the perpetual debt, the boiling oil, or the chaotic lawlessness that forged the character of the first settlers. This created a subtle but significant cultural rift. The younger generation, the heirs of the dust, began to see the formal, protective laws established by Ilara's assembly not as hard-won shields against tyranny, but as irritating restraints on their own ambition. They chafed at the concept of a jury of peers, often preferring the old, quick, decisive arbitration by duel that their fathers had used to settle claims. They romanticized the Wild West period of their parents' struggle, not understanding the true terror of it, viewing the vigilante justice of the Corvus incident as a heroic ideal, rather than a regrettable necessity. This romanticization led to a new form of power abuse. The most wealthy and connected of the heirs of the dust learned to manipulate the system. They used their inherited funds to hire expert advocates and even corrupt members of the Western Guard to enforce their will, effectively buying justice, or, conversely, buying a perpetual shield against prosecution. The old, overt cruelty of King Uther had been replaced by the slick, bureaucratic injustice of the elite, a more sophisticated form of power abuse that was harder to fight because it hid behind the very legal structures the pioneers had fought so hard to establish. Ilara saw this erosion with a heavy heart. Her final moral lesson, the one she struggled to impart to her successors, was that the American dream, the frontier ideal of a life unowned, is not something that can be simply inherited. It must be earned anew by each generation through a commitment to equity and justice. She tried to warn them that the moment they believed their wealth gave them the right to circumvent the law, they were merely reinstalling a new, localized version of King Uther's tyranny. Only this time, it would be a tyranny justified by merit and hard work rather than divine right. One particular incident crystallized this new injustice: the case of young Lord Vance, the grandson of a powerful pioneer who had struck a massive silver vein. Vance used his considerable influence to push through a new local ordinance in his territory, a law that forbade any new settlers from staking a claim within 5 miles of an established mine. He justified it as protecting resource integrity, but everyone knew it was simply a means of creating a permanent, protected monopoly for his family and his allies. This new law, though passed by the Assembly, fundamentally betrayed the core frontier principle of open access and equal opportunity for all. A protest arose, led by a new wave of poor, hopeful settlers who had arrived too late to claim the easy land. They argued the new law was essentially a return to the feudal system, a creation of untouchable, inherited territory, exactly what the perpetual debt had sought to enforce. They camped outside the Western Assembly Hall, demanding that the charter be amended to enshrine the principle of constant, open access to unclaimed lands, arguing that the spirit of the Wild West demanded no fences on opportunity. Ilara, infirm but still sharp, supported the protesters. She realized the danger was no longer the crown, but the complacency of success. She made one final, impassioned journey to the assembly hall, carried on a litter, to address the ruling heirs of the dust. Her voice was raspy, but her authority was absolute. She spoke not of laws, but of the smell of the dust, the cold of the march's night, the fear of the bandit, and the searing memory of the boiling oil. She reminded them that the freedom they enjoyed was only valuable so long as it remained a possibility for everyone, not a protected privilege for the few. Her words had a powerful, immediate effect. They were shamed by the ghost of the frontier she represented. The Western Assembly, under immense pressure and moral reflection, repealed Vance's law and in its place passed the Edict of Shared Frontier, which guaranteed a rolling, open system of claiming that always reserved a portion of new resource discoveries for the newest, poorest arrivals. It was a formal acknowledgement that the dream had to be perpetually renewed and protected from the very people who had successfully achieved it. This final act, driven by the moral force of the generation who had known true hardship, completed the legacy of the Wild West. It showed that the frontier's ultimate gift was not just the chance to get rich, but the necessary realization that true success must be balanced by a commitment to the ongoing promise of opportunity for all. The Wild West, in its chaos and its demanding necessity, forced the creation of a system that, while imperfect and forever struggling with the tension between individual liberty and collective good, explicitly demanded that the door to the American dream, the chance to start over, to build a new life, must never, ever be completely closed. The story, therefore, is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a complex, enduring narrative of how the brutality of a lawless place shaped a hopeful ideal into a deeply imperfect, yet fiercely guarded cultural promise. And that, in its endless complexity and enduring struggle for equity, is the truest reflection of the American dream, forged not in comfort, but in the relentless, unforgiving dust of the frontier. The sun finally sets over the marches, now a settled, prosperous territory, but the ghost of the wild wind still whispers the old, difficult lessons to the new generation. The quiet, persistent challenge of the frontier never truly ended. It just changed form, mutating from the external threats of bandits and kings to the internal threats of complacency and inherited power. The heirs of the dust, though forced by Ilara's intervention to open the frontier once again, found other, more subtle ways to exert their influence, maintaining that tension between the wealthy elite and the struggling newcomer that is so foundational to the modern understanding of the American dream. They began to control the cost of the tools, the price of the salt, and the interest rates on the meager loans necessary to start a new life in the marches. The frontier dream was still alive, but it had acquired an invisible economic toll gate, guarded not by armed men, but by ledgers and contracts. This shift brought about the final, most sophisticated chapter of the Wild West's influence, the transition from physical conquest to economic dominion. The struggle was no longer about staking a claim with a pickaxe and a rifle or a sword, but about navigating a complex web of economic dependencies. The old pioneers, in their righteous fight against King Other's tax, had not guarded against the tyranny of the market. The quiet, pervasive power of those who control the necessary means of production and finance. A new character emerged from this environment, Silas, a keen, merciless merchant who had followed the gold rush not to mine, but to supply the miners. Silas never lifted a pickaxe, never faced a bandit, and never stood against Lord Malachi's injustice. He was the quiet beneficiary of everyone else's struggle. He learned quickly that in a self-reliant, decentralized frontier, dependence on supplies was absolute. He became the sole distributor of the most vital resource, the specially hardened iron tools required to break the stubborn earth of the marches. Silas implemented a system that was, ironically, a perfect, market-driven parallel to King Uther's edict of perpetual debt. He offered tools and supplies on a credit system, requiring the settlers to mortgage a percentage of their future yield, often starting at 20%, but escalating rapidly with even the slightest delay in payment. If a settler suffered a poor season, an injury, or a run of bad luck, the interest compounded relentlessly. Within a few short years, many of the original pioneers, the heroes who had stood against Malachi, found themselves working their own claims, which were technically still their own, but with a full third, sometimes half of their entire production legally obligated to Silas the merchant. This was the economic Wild West. It was legal, codified, and untouchable by the Western Assembly's laws on property, because Silas was not stealing land. He was simply collecting on a contract. The moral injustice was palpable, yet the legal path to fighting it was almost non-existent. The settlers had demanded individual freedom and self-determination, and the market had responded by weaponizing those very contracts against the weaker players. Elara, now too old and frail to lead another physical revolt, used her last political leverage to fight this new form of bondage. She argued before the assembly that the spirit of the charter, the guarantee of opportunity, was being choked by these exploitative contracts. She proposed a revolutionary concept, the usury law, a set of restrictions that would cap the maximum allowable interest on any loan or credit agreement, specifically targeting Silas's practices. The debate was fierce. The wealthy heirs of the dust, who had either partnered with Silas or were engaging in similar practices, argued that any regulation on contracts was a betrayal of the core, frontier value of free exchange and limited government interference. They shouted that Elara was trying to impose a new tyranny, worse than others, a tyranny of socialist redistribution and centralized economic planning. They had fully internalized the Wild West's anti-authoritarian stance, using it as a shield for their own economic exploitation. The poor settlers, the ones facing ruin, countered with desperation, arguing that freedom was meaningless if it only led to a new form of debt slavery, where the chains were made of parchment instead of iron. The assembly was deadlocked, paralyzed by the conflict between their foundational belief in individual economic liberty and the moral necessity of protecting the common person's access to the dream. In a dramatic, final political maneuver, Elara leveraged her historical authority. She did not merely argue the morality of the situation, she argued the history. She pointed out that King Uther's cruelty was defined by the forced, unjust extraction of 50% of a person's labor. She demonstrated, using Silas's own meticulously kept ledgers, that through high interest and compounding debt, Silas was effectively extracting the same percentage, the same edict of perpetual debt, but with the full legal sanction of their self-governing system. The only difference, she declared, was that Uther had used the threat of torture, while Silas used the threat of starvation and eviction, both equally ruinous. The realization was a punch to the conscience of the assembly. They saw the reflection of their old oppressor in their new, market-driven prosperity. They realized that the freedom they had fought for was not just political, but economic, and that to protect the American dream, they had to be willing to regulate the worst excesses of the very economic liberty they held dear. They passed the usury law by the narrowest of margins, setting a moral, if not universally popular, precedent for collective economic protection. Silas the merchant was not crushed. He was far too shrewd for that. He simply adapted, finding new legal loopholes and new forms of investment that kept him wealthy, proving the relentless, fluid nature of economic power. But the usury law accomplished something profound. It codified the idea that the American dream, the freedom of the frontier, had a necessary floor, a line of basic human decency that even the free market could not be allowed to cross. It was a formal recognition that the spirit of the Wild West, pure, unchecked individual ambition, needed the tempering influence of collective responsibility to prevent the dream from devouring its own. Ilara died shortly after, the physical embodiment of the revolutionary generation passing into history. Her legacy was not the gold she mined, but the moral and legal framework she tirelessly fought to establish, the ongoing compromise between the beautiful, brutal individualism of the frontier and the necessary, protective strictures of a just society. The marches continued to prosper, but the lesson endured. The shaping of the American dream by the Wild West was a continuous, active struggle, a permanent negotiation between the desire to be entirely free and the need to be fairly protected. The dust of the frontier never truly settled. It simply became the soil upon which the next generation would plant their own, equally complex, struggles for balance. The dust of the frontier never truly settled. It simply became the soil upon which the next generation would plant their own, equally complex, struggles for balance. This new generation, the grandchildren of the pioneers, inherited not only the wealth and the complex legal structure, but also a deep-seated, almost genetic distrust of any organized, centralized force, a lingering neurosis born from the terror of King Uther's guards and Lord Malachi's absolute, localized tyranny. This cultural anxiety manifested most clearly in the ongoing tension surrounding the Western Guard. This was the official, now well-funded, self-governing military and law enforcement body of the marches, the successor to the Vigilance Committee that Ilara had so successfully dismantled and formalized. The Guard's official mandate was to protect the settlements from external threats, the remaining bandits and the occasional, restless tribal factions on the outer edges, and to enforce the laws of the charter internally. But the citizens of the marches, raised on the heroic, if bloody, tales of their grandparents, held an almost sacred belief in the necessity of personal armament. Every respectable homestead, every successful mining camp, had its own small armory, its own drilled defense system. The prevailing wisdom, the ultimate Wild West inheritance, was, your safety is your own responsibility. They saw the Western Guard as a useful convenience, a force for the really big problems, but never as the ultimate, final arbiter of their protection. This created a volatile situation, a perpetual conflict between the official law and the ingrained culture of self-defense. The Guard, naturally, began to resent this distrust. They saw themselves as professionals, risking their lives for a populace that viewed them with suspicion and insisted on stockpiling their own arms, a clear signal that they were not fully trusted to do their job. It was into this simmering tension that we find Reese, Alara's grandson. Reese was a scholar, a man of parchment and law, unlike his pioneering grandmother. He had been elected to the Western Assembly, representing the newer, more centralized settlement that had sprung up where the first stone wall had been built. He was the voice of reason, the advocate for complete integration and trust in the established system, the embodiment of the final, stable dream. His challenge came from within the Guard itself. The Guard, growing fat and complacent with their steady budget and the easing of true, external threats, began to suffer from the very corruption they were meant to prevent. Their captain, a brutal and ambitious man named Commander Boren, was a product of the later frontier, a man who had not earned his position through pioneering merit, but through political maneuvering and the patronage of the wealthier heirs of the dust, those who favored a strong hand to protect their monopolies. Boren began to use his Guard not for justice, but for enforcement of the economic tyranny Alara had fought against. He would dispatch armed patrols to assist Silas, the merchant's agents, in evicting small settlers who had defaulted on their exploitative loans, providing a muscle for the economic system that made the usury law seem like a mere speed bump. This was power abuse, insidious and legal, operating within the boundaries of a contract the pioneers had foolishly signed. The ultimate act of Boren's arrogance and corruption involved a small, poor family of prospectors who had finally struck a minor vein of gold on their claim, a claim that was, unfortunately, adjacent to a mine owned by one of Boren's wealthy patrons. The patron, wanting the smaller claim, invented a minor infraction, a misplaced boundary stone, a claim that the prospectors were mining too close to his established line. The law required a formal survey and a hearing before the assembly. But Boren, acting on his own authority, sent a detachment of the Western Guard, fully uniformed and armed, not to investigate, but to forcibly remove the family. The family, relying on the sacred frontier tenet of self-defense, refused to leave their property, barricading themselves in their rough-hewn cabin. What followed was a tragic, inevitable clash of the two competing visions of the marches. The Guard, representing the official law, surrounded the cabin. The family, representing the personal law, the innate right to defend their own hard-won claim, prepared to fight. When the Guard finally breached the door, driven by Boren's ruthless orders, the resulting violence was quick, chaotic, and deadly. The entire family was killed, labeled by Boren as armed resistors of the legitimate authority. The shockwave that rippled through the marches was devastating. It was a betrayal deeper than others' initial taxes, because this tyranny was being executed by their own people, under the banner of the very authority they had fought to establish. It proved to the settlers that the distrust of centralized power, the instinct to rely only on one's own gun and grit, was not a relic of the past, but a tragically validated necessity. The American dream was, once again, revealed to be fragile, constantly under threat from within. Reese, witnessing the brutal arrogance of Boren and the total erosion of the Assembly's authority, knew that the usury law and the charter were meaningless if the enforcement body was corrupt and unchecked. He saw that the new struggle was not political, but fundamentally moral. How do you convince a frontier people who value self-reliance above all else to submit to a communal force that has proven itself capable of becoming the very oppressor they fear? He did not call for an army or a revolt. He took a different, more politically sophisticated approach. He used his position in the assembly to introduce a series of transparency edicts, demanding that the entire budget, deployment logs, and disciplinary records of the Western Guard be made public, available for review by every settlement. He also demanded the implementation of an independent civilian review board, a council of non-guard citizens empowered to investigate all claims of misconduct or abuse of power. Commander Boren was arrogant enough to dismiss this as bureaucratic nonsense. He publicly ridiculed Reese, labeling him a soft scholar whose hands had never held anything heavier than a pen, not understanding that in the now settled marches, the pen was becoming mightier and certainly more legally binding than the sword. Boren was too consumed by his own petty fiefdom, too proud of the unquestioned loyalty he had cultivated in his corrupt guard. But Reese was persistent. He understood the power of the march's deep-seated individualism. He framed the issue not as fighting corruption, but as protecting personal liberty. He toured the settlements, using the memory of his grandmother, Elara, to remind them that the Guard, left unchecked, was simply a collective tyrant, and that a truly free man must demand accountability from all those who claim the right to bear the public sword. His message resonated. If you truly own your life, you must also own the responsibility to audit the power that claims to protect it. The pressure from the settlements, fueled by the memory of the prospector family's brutal end, became irresistible. The assembly, finally roused from its complacency, passed the transparency edicts and the civilian review board. Boren, in a final act of arrogance and defiance, refused to comply. He locked down the Guard headquarters, declared the assembly compromised, and prepared for a military standoff, believing the settlers would side with the force of arms over the force of paper. This was the ultimate downfall of the arrogant, localized ruler. Boren had misjudged the new character of the marches. He expected a chaotic, disorganized revolt that he could easily crush. Instead, the settlements did not march on the headquarters. They simply stopped cooperating. They refused to sell food to the Guard. They refused to provide horses. They refused to repair the Guard's equipment. The settlers, still heavily armed and perfectly capable of defending themselves, simply enforced an economic and logistical blockade, effectively starving the military wing of its own lifeblood. The standoff lasted only 3 days. Boren's own men, realizing they were not fighting an enemy but being abandoned by their entire society, began to desert in droves, melting back into the settlements that had provided them with their homes and families. Boren, utterly isolated and realizing his own authority was nothing more than the loyalty of the last handful of men he could physically intimidate, was arrested, not by a rival army, but by a small, determined group from the Civilian Review Board, led by Reese, who served the arrest warrant and peacefully escorted him to the new public courthouse. Boren was subjected to a public trial, the ultimate victory of the rule of law over frontier lawlessness. He was tried not by a vigilante committee, but by a jury of his peers, found guilty of abuse of power and murder, and sentenced not to death, but to perpetual labor, dismantling the very guardhouse he had used as a fortress of his corruption. Justice in the marches had finally achieved a level of measured, public accountability that completely distanced it from the barbaric, cruel systems of the past. The moral of this complex continuation is profound. The Wild West experience did not just shape the American dream by offering opportunity. It shaped it by forcing a constant, violent, and necessary internal dialogue about the limits of power. It taught the citizens of the marches that the dream requires a constant, active defense, not just against external tyrants like King Other, but against the insidious tyranny that can grow within their own self-established institutions. The enduring legacy of the frontier is the creation of a citizen who, even when establishing a formal government, remains fundamentally skeptical of it, a cultural trait that demands transparency and accountability as the price of allegiance. The Wild West instilled the need for personal sovereignty so deeply that it forever prevented the people from fully trusting any master, whether that master wore a crown, held a ledger, or commanded the very guard they had created for their own protection. The struggle for balance is the enduring essence of the dream, the constant, difficult negotiation between the necessary freedom of the individual and the equally necessary authority of the state. This is the endless, quiet rhythm of the marches, a place forever defined by the dust of its challenging beginning. The quiet rhythm of the marches, once defined by the chaotic clatter of the gold rush, slowly settled into the steady beat of commerce and agriculture. The settlements grew into proper, well-established towns, complete with stone-paved streets, public markets, and yes, those slow, deliberate courts of law. The Western Guard became a force of community support, its men trained not to intimidate, but to serve, a hard-won lesson written in the shame of Commander Boren's downfall. The marches, the former Wild West, was no longer a frantic frontier. It was now the established West, a new center of gravity and aspiration for the rest of the kingdom. But even prosperity could not erase the memory of the dust and the struggle. The citizens of the marches, the frontier stock, maintained a distinct identity, one that was immediately recognizable throughout Ethelgard. They were noted for their independent spirit, their refusal to bow to unnecessary ceremony, and their fierce, almost territorial pride in their personal property. A man from the marches, regardless of his wealth, still carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows he can rely on his own two hands, a permanent inheritance from the days when self-reliance was the only law that mattered. This psychological independence became the ultimate, lasting contribution of the Wild West to the evolving Ethelgardian dream. When a citizen of the older eastern provinces spoke of success, they often meant pleasing a noble or accumulating enough titles to impress their neighbors. But when a citizen of the marches spoke of the dream, they meant the absence of masters, the integrity of the individual's effort, and the unassailable right to decide their own future, a pure, unadulterated sovereignty over their own life. It was a philosophy born of desperate escape and forged in necessary self-defense. Rhys, now the venerable elder statesman, much like his grandmother Alara before him, would spend his evenings on his porch, a slight breeze carrying the scent of pine and rich, turned earth. He would watch the lights of the town, no longer a cluster of haphazard fires, but a constellation of sturdy, permanent homes. He knew, better than anyone, the immense cost of the order they had achieved. It had cost them the life of the prospector family, the terror of Malachi's reign, and the constant, agonizing political struggle to keep the dream from being corrupted by greed. One evening, his young apprentice, a boy named Liam who was training to be a judge, asked him a simple, profound question. "Master Rhys," the boy asked, "if the laws are so good now, if the guard is honest and the crown is benevolent, why do all our homesteads still have those old, heavy iron doors and those thick stone fences? We don't need to fear the king or the bandit anymore, do we?" Rhys smiled, a tired but gentle curve of his lips. He looked out at the vast, silent expanse of the former marches. "We don't need to fear them, no, Liam," he replied softly, his voice a low hum. "But those doors and those fences are not just against the bandit who might come. They are a monument to the bandit who was here, and the king who was here, and the corrupt official who was here. They are a physical reminder, a quiet lesson in stone and iron, that the authority of the state, no matter how good, is always secondary to the ultimate authority of the individual to protect what is theirs." He paused, letting the weight of the frontier history settle into the twilight. "The Wild West taught us that freedom is not granted, but claimed, and that a life unowned by any outside force is a life that must be eternally and fiercely guarded by the owner. The stone doors are the physical expression of the American dream's core value, a skepticism that keeps power honest, and a self-reliance that ensures survival." He looked at the young man, his eyes carrying the distant flicker of a million campfires. "The dust of the marches settled into the foundation of our culture, Liam. It made us vigilant. It made us demanding. And it made our dream the most resilient, most challenging dream in the kingdom. That tension, that constant negotiation between the door that locks out the world and the hand that holds the key to the community, is the legacy. We have built a civilization, but we will never forget how to be an individual." The night air grew cool, the town lights twinkling like scattered gold dust. Reese gently pulled a rough woolen blanket over his knees, the gesture a final nod to the practical, unpretentious spirit of the pioneers. The kingdom was stable, the charter was firm, and the dream of opportunity of a life free from arbitrary power was finally truly alive, a beautiful, stubborn flower rooted in the hard, unforgiving soil of the old frontier. The long, hard journey of the marches, the endless struggle for balance, had found its quiet, momentary peace. And with that deep-seated, hard-won tranquility settling over the land and its vigilant people, the only sound left was the soft sigh of the night wind, a sound that always carried a faint echo of the old, wild freedom. The story of the frontier, the story of the dream, was complete for the day. "Good night,"